In my short part on the website on Adventist Today, I told a little bit about my story and where I come from and how Sabbath has made a real impact in my life because of the way I grew up and where I grew up. So I grew up in Romania in the time of Ceausescu's ruling over there, and as you know, the history of that part of the world was definitely not on freedom and allowing expression and allowing religious expression, especially. So that is where I grew up, and from the first days, for example, when I went to school, I experienced that. So this story that I told here when I was about 8 years old in second grade of the teacher has never left me, and I still remember it very vividly. But at the same time, this story has become kind of like a guiding pole throughout my life, especially when it came to ask myself, so what would I choose as a topic of research and as a topic that should not only be a piece in the Bible that is discussed and evaluated, but that also would take me throughout the rest of my life as a person and also as a scholar. So I chose the topic of Sabbath because I remembered those days, and I asked myself, why is Sabbath so important? Why do we as Seventh-day Adventists consider Sabbath so important in the Bible? And to look at it from the perspective of a 24-hour day, only after you feel and experience what it means to keep Sabbath. Sabbath is not only a 24/7, a 24-hour day. And so I went after researching what is its meaning, what is its inner heart, its essence that is so important in the Bible to God and to the Adventist Church, that we consider it even as a matter of end time dividing element, where the world is supposed to be either on the one side or on the other side, and all Sabbath keepers are supposed to be on the side of God. So what is it that makes this 24-hour day so important that it takes that message, that long-lasting message? So for that reason, I chose to research the Sabbath in the Pentateuch. And I looked into the texts in Genesis, the creation story, the Sabbath in the creation story, and then, of course, the text in the book of Exodus, especially where we have the Sabbath in the fourth commandment, but also in other places in the book of Exodus. And we have it in the rest of the Pentateuch, in every part. We have it in the book of Leviticus, we have it in Numbers, and of course we come to the text in the book of Deuteronomy. So that is my area that I have been researching this text, not for the sake of doing a defense of the Sabbath, that it is the correct day, but what is the text actually telling me? What is its story? What is its context? And what does it want me to see in those texts in the Pentateuch? So that is my topic. And because of that, I am looking at the Sabbath from the perspective of a macro history, if you will, and looking into it from the aspect of a storytelling text, a narrative that conveys meaning and then takes meaning every time we tell the story again and again either through our own lives, through the way we understand it, through the way we witness to it. So I would like to bring in today in this discussion a couple of authors that I am indebted especially for their deep spiritual insights and the experiences that they have gone through. Both of them are Jewish authors. And the first, and I will give you a couple of citations from them. The first is, and I'm showing you the book by Abraham Joshua Heschel. I recommend this little book very much in my classroom to my students. I consider it the most beautiful about Sabbath. Deeply spiritual, deeply meaningful, and also with great insight into the tradition of Sabbath keeping that is far, far older than we Adventists consider ourselves. As Adventist keepers and Sabbath keepers, we are on this planet only for a couple hundred years. And the people who actually bring the Sabbath to us, who are the ones who are the, if you will, the origin for this Sabbath keeping, are the Jewish people. And it would be, I would say, even sacrilegious to not listen to their voices and to not learn from them. So that is one writer that I will present today. And the other one is Elie Wiesel, who is a Holocaust survivor and speaks about the intense way of going about a life in this world. How do we deal with faith, with the questions, the hard questions in life? So these are the two authors that I will introduce to you as well. Let me start my slides with you. So you should now be able to see them, I hope. Okay, here is Heschel. Heschel, who came to the United States, escaping the Nazi regime in Germany, and who had studied in Germany and then came to the US and became a professor in the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York City at first. He also, later in his life, comes to be well known in the civil rights movement. We have a great picture of him marching together with Martin Luther King to Selma on that march. And here is him as a scholar, as a reader of this text, as a witness to a thousands of years old tradition, speaking about the difference between looking into the Bible with reason, with logic, and trying to dissect the biblical text for its accuracy or for its correctness, if it is historically correct or not, and so on. But then he goes clearly beyond that in the way that a reason can only take us so far, especially when we discuss religion, when we discuss God. Because God goes beyond anything that we can even think of or even imagine. And so Heschel becomes the writer about wonder, the mysterious, that which is only perceived through awe, and a world that exists because there is something greater beyond it. So those aspects will take us into the next parts here of our story about the Sabbath. I have a little trouble. It doesn't take my slides on if I keep it shared. Anybody know how to do that? Oh, there we go. So in my brief part in Adventist Today, I mentioned this movie. I think it is a wonderful movie for it by itself, with great pictures. If you have not watched it, I do recommend it, especially on a wide, big screen, because the images are just outstanding and outerworldly, if you will. So Life of Pi is the movie of a young Indian boy, a Tamil boy, who looks in his young age for those things, those questions that are issues of spirituality, the issues about meaning for life. And so his family eventually decides to leave India and to travel on a ship to get across. And I believe the destination should be Canada. So the ship suffers a shipwreck. And it is the young boy who ends up in a boat. And when he tells the story later on, how he survived, he tells the version about a tiger by the name of Richard Parker. And the tiger is, of course, his enemy, and he has to find ways to keep him in check in order to not be eaten up by the tiger. And then there, of course, are all kinds of other disasters that come, storms and so on. And yet he survives for all those days, 227 days on the boat. And when the interviewers come to question him, he will tell this story first, and they are blown away by that story, how he was able to survive on that boat with a tiger in it, and then going through all those other difficulties. So he comes to the end, and these two men are not able to write that story down because they are sent to get the real story, the story where the actual things happen. And so when he tells them that story in the end, that story is not beautiful. It's not perfect. It is not extraordinary and mysterious. It has a lot of things in it that are like evil, and the destruction is given in detail about how others who were part of this journey in the boat died and so on. So at the end, after telling the other version of the story, he asks this question: so which story do you prefer? And the answer is, well, the one with the tiger, the one with all those extraordinary images, and images that you can create in your mind, not just on the screen. It's the better story. And that is what makes this movie so well and perfect to speak about how we tell the story of God, the story of the Bible, the story of Sabbath today. Because that is an amazing story. And that story, I will take it from a few passages that I'm giving you here. The first one that I want to go a little bit into, but not too much, is the story in Exodus 16. It's about Sabbath and manna. The other ones are the laws that we know so well. We learn them by memory, the fourth commandment. And then we have also a few texts in other parts where Sabbath is connected to the building of the tabernacle or the sanctuary. So what do we gain? How do we read? How do we listen and hear these stories in the Bible? Are we looking for the reasonable story, the story that deals with the accuracy of it, where we want to fix it on a written text, on a word in there? For example, the manna story. If we make it into that reasonable story, then we have a group of people who are constantly complaining. They go through the desert, they need food, and they are definitely not happy with their leadership. They are looking with fear into the future. They are not going to survive. That is the reasonable story when you enter into a desert place. And then we see Moses giving them instructions. Do this, do that. Don't go out together. Go out together every morning, but do not do it on the seventh day. And of course, there is a lot of failures happening in that story. So that would be the dry story, the story that is told through logic and reason. And we want to make it into that story where people are failing, and then finally God comes up as the hero in it. Well, if we take another look into that same story, then there are a lot of things, a lot of hints, if you will, that speak to something that goes beyond our reasoning. There are the senses, our way of feeling and doing and seeing and hearing are involved constantly throughout the entire text. Pay attention how the people are fearful. They experience that fear. They do not only say it out loud, it is inside of them. And everyone here on this, in our community here, I'm sure understands fear is something that comes from deep inside, and then it expresses itself on the outside in very different ways. The people see things. The people are asked to go out early in the morning and take a look far into the desert across the landscape and see the cloud, the shiny cloud standing there. They are hearing voices. They are hearing what is going on between Moses and Aaron speaking. The people are speaking. They are smelling the things that they collect from the ground. They touch it, they taste it. All those things are given in the text. And then they are supposed to eat until they are full, until they are satisfied. The entire story is then also cast into an experience of time. There are so many references to time and what happens in the morning, early morning, at night, throughout the day, the next day, and so on. And in the end, it all concludes with that report that all of this kind of experience of the senses happens basically week after week after week for 40 years until they enter into the promised land. So what I mean is the story about Sabbath and food is not a story to be dissected and made into a reasonable and logical element about the failures and the grumblings of people. It is about the experience of the people as they travel through a dry, barren place, and yet there is the miracle of food happening again and again on a daily basis, and there is that rhythm that is set up through that cycle of 6 days collecting, and then the one day where it is for free, where it comes about. And then that is when people will have to finally come to acknowledge and see, what is this? And we read in the Bible the word for manna. And we think manna is the name of a special kind of food. And yet manna is a question. Manna is, what is it? It's the question that will be with the people, according to the biblical story, every day. What is this? For 40 years, you get it again and again, and you don't understand it logically, reasonably. Every day you have to ask that question again. What is this? That is manna. And it is Sabbath that creates that cycle, that brings it back, so that it is not only a one-time event passed in the history of a group of people, nomadic people traveling through a desert place, but it becomes an element of mystery, a question that comes back all the time. That is the story of manna in Exodus chapter 16. The next one is the story of the Sabbath, and we have it in the laws, especially and directly expressed. It's in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 to 11. And again, it is so easy for us to make it into that reasonable story, where we look at these 10 commandments and understand them as a system of rules. They are to regulate the behavior of people who were slaves and now need to be put in place, basically, by the law. And then when we come to the Sabbath, especially to the fourth commandment, when we as Adventists read it and memorize it and speak it out loud again and again, usually what we do is we look at it as this is the right day. This is the day that God has created for us. It's the day that we are supposed to keep. And then we ask the question about work. What are we allowed to do? What are we not allowed to do? And the debate goes back and forth about that kind of work. And if we glance again into that text, there is nothing said about what kind of work. Adventists have also the tendency to look into this text in the book of Exodus 20 from the perspective of, yes, this is the day that God has given to this world in creation, because the text says it. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, right? Well, here is that logical story if we look at it that way. But what if we take another look? What if we ask the question again and say, who is this God that is speaking here in a loud, thunderous voice from the top of a mountain? Who are the people? How do they experience and hear that voice? And when it comes to work, what is it actually saying there in that text about work? So here is the text. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. So that first question, who is this God, is directly addressed there. This is your God. It is the Lord your God. And I'm sure I don't have to do a lot of explanation about the 4 capitals in the word for Lord that you see on the screen. And we are so used to them in our Bibles. Maybe we forgot O-R-D in capitalized form here is a reference to the Yahweh in the Bible, the God who becomes the God who is close, the God who in creation times comes so close that he breathes into the nostrils of humans the breath of life. He, in other words, or in the Jewish imagination, this is the first kiss that God gives to the human. So he's the God who enters into a close relationship, into a covenant with his people. It is the God who speaks to the people so that as a God who has already brought them out from slavery. The first line in Exodus chapter 20 that often we read, but then we forget when we continue reading the rest of the 10 Commandments. that first line, I am the Lord your God who brought you out from the house of slavery, out from the land of Egypt. That first line, if you place that in front of each of the 10 commandments, I am the Lord your God who brought you out. You shall not have another God beside me. That is when each of the 10 commandments suddenly takes on a different way of understanding. If I am your God, then you will not. And you can put in there each one of the 10 commandments. Another part, another question here in Exodus 20 is about the people. Who are these people who hear God speaking? And the first thing I would like to mention is that God speaks to the individual. And we need to point it out, especially when we read the Bible in English, because your, that preposition, that personal pronoun, can be singular or plural. And it is easy to think of it as a plural because all these people are gathered at the base of the mountain and listen to God and see those miraculous events happening. So it is in the Hebrew text, in the original text, that we recognize the your in every time when it is mentioned as a singular you in the 10 commandments. God, in other words, the Lord is your God, and to you as an individual. He's a personal God to you. He is not the God who has a community in front of him where people can disappear in the crowd. He's a God who speaks to the individual. And when he does that, especially in this 4th commandment, we have a list mentioned here of individuals who are directly addressed. In it, and I would like you to take a look at this text again and count how many are there that are mentioned that should not work. We are in the text about the 7th day, and it is the day that is here called also Sabbath. And the list includes 7 members. It's the perfect day of the creation week. It's the perfect community of people where the number 7 conveys that idea of whole, a whole community, and they all belong together. Each one is addressed, each one is seen within that community. There is no one who is overlooked. Even the cattle are present, according to this text, even the animals. There is the son and the daughter, there is the male and the female servant or slave, there are the cattle, and there is the stranger or the sojourner, who, as this translation gives it. So it's each person who is present here. But in the story of these people, in the context story of these people who were out of slavery for only about 2 months, you can go back to Exodus 19, the first verse, where it says that it is in the very beginning of the 3rd month when they arrived there. So they are out of Egypt only for about 2 months. Slavery is inside the human being. Slavery persists to live inside. And God addresses them and says, I have brought you out, and I give you this day as a day of freedom. What a message for people who have just escaped. What a message, not a commandment, not a law, but a gift of freedom. And then I like to take my students to imagine also, so if you were back there in Egypt, if you just think of it, if you were back there in Egypt and that Egyptian slave master would knock on your door and say, today I need your son to come and plow the field. Today, I need your daughter to come and clean the house. Would you have a choice? Would you be able to say no on this day? You wouldn't, because you were a slave just like your son, your daughter, and everybody else. So the aspect of that now, this seventh day, this Sabbath, establishes this whole community as an integrated community with each member part of it, each member seen within that community, each one enjoying the same gift of freedom. That is an extraordinary command, if you will. That is an extraordinary law in the context of an ancient world. And so the Sabbath truly needs to be seen as that, a revolutionary kind of law in an ancient Near Eastern context, where there is a deity, a God, who looks at people as human beings. In this text, each one of those parts are established and identified as humans, as creatures of God, including the slave, including the stranger that is in there. I will talk about that a little bit more in the next verse that we discuss here. The end part is about, so we should not work. So what is work, if you will? That would be the question. What is work from the perspective of that voice from the mountain, of that Lord God? Is it the question, can I go and do a swim in the ocean or on Sabbath or not? Can I hike up the mountain? Can I eat out or not? Those are questions that we ask today. But pay attention again. There is a parallelism in the text itself that makes it, I believe, especially clear. It says 6 days you do your work. And then the parallelism to those 6 days is, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth. And that is the clue, that line at the end is the clue where the biblical writer wants you and me as readers to go back to that story where God made the heavens and the earth, where God gives us that narrative about the first day, the second day, the third day, and so on, those 6 days. In my classroom, I ask my students to divide into 6 groups. And I asked them to go back to Genesis chapter 1 to read a text. And each group has one of the passages. And then ask the question, so what did God do and how did he do it? And what's the conclusion on that day? If you go back up from the conclusion, each day ends with the word, it was good. God saw and it was good, isn't it? So it was good. Work that is done is good. In that story, God is telling us about work. Work that needs to become meaningful to us, even in a world where we so often experience work as stress, as a burden, as being exhausted at the end. So what is work? Maybe there is a challenge to look at work from a different perspective, from a different way. What if we note that on that first day when it says, let there be light, there was light, and God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. What if we would make that a text about the cosmic world into a text that has meaning to you and me as personal as human beings today? What if in our own world we need some light? For my students who live in the dorms here at Walla Walla University, I asked them to take a look into their closets, to take a look into their room, on their desk. What if we need to separate a few things, put them into different piles so that some light is able to enter in there? And if you will, it sounds very simple, but that is a very thing that is actually said in that story of creation in Genesis 1. God separated. Throughout the 6 days, God constantly separated one from another. And by separating things, there was then at the end the whole that came about. That which God then at the end always calls good. And at the end of the 6th week, everything is very good. And then comes the 7th day, where it says, and God completed all his work, and he blessed it, and he sanctified the day. So the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20 gives us a different perspective when we look at it from that aspect of an experience of people who hear God speaking to them, and they become human beings. Identity is formed for an individual, not only a group, a nation, but for an individual. I hope I still have some more time, because the next text is in Exodus chapter 23, verse 12. This is a short text, and I put a text here because it's so short, and we don't read it often. So 6 days you are to do your work, but on the 7th day you shall cease, and that is where the word Shabbat is used. You shall stop. In other words, you do Sabbath. A Sabbath, in other words, is a verb. You do it, you stop. And then the purpose is given so that your ox and your donkey may rest. Note that the animals come first here, and these are the hard-working animals on the farms. And then it adds an element that, again, falls out of the norm, because it mentions the son of your slave woman, as well as your stranger, and they may refresh themselves. That is how my Bible in the NASB gives it to us. So the son of the slave woman is not mentioned in the other Sabbath commandments in Exodus 20, or the one part that we have in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The son of your slave woman is an expression that is rarely used in the Pentateuch. It is used only a couple other times. It's in a special story, and that's the story of Genesis 21. Here we have the story of Ishmael and Hagar. And Hagar is the slave who is expelled for the 2nd time by Abraham and Sarah when they cannot stand her anymore. And she goes out into the desert, and the child is about to die. And that is where that expression, the son of the slave woman, it comes again to us in that story of these expelled people. It is also in that story where we hear how God pays attention, how he hears what is going on. He heard the voice of the boy, especially. It's mentioned several times throughout the text, and clearly in verse 17. And then the angel comes and brings provision and brings relief to them. But that theme of God hearing people cry out to him then becomes, in the Pentateuch, a theme that triggers the Exodus story. The people of Israel in Egypt cry out because they suffer under the slavery of the Egyptian Pharaoh. And God hears their cries. I heard the cry of my people. I heard the cries of the sons of Israel. It is repeated at least 3 times in the beginning of the book of Exodus. And so we recognize that this Sabbath commandment has a much deeper element that we need to uncover, and not only read the words, but uncover the depth of it in the background. The next part that we read about in that text is about the stranger. it is also the stranger who should be able to be refreshed. So again, this text in its context gives us about the story about who is actually the stranger. Just a few verses above in chapter 22, verse 21, we read, "Do not wrong a stranger or oppress him, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt." And again in 23:9, "You do not oppress a stranger, because you not only were strangers, but you also know how it feels to be a stranger." The Hebrew has here the Hebrew word nefesh. It's the life of the stranger. It's not only the soul, it's everything that the person experiences. You know the feelings, you know the life of the stranger, because you were a stranger in Egypt. And I take you back now to the text. Because if you have your Bibles open, maybe, if you have a Bible that has references and explanations and footnotes and so on, you may even have a little number or a sign raised when it comes to the word stranger in your English Bible. In my Bible, the NASB, there is a footnote to it. And that footnote shows some very interesting part, namely when the text uncovers the story from Genesis 21 about Hagar and Ishmael in the expression of the son of the slave woman. Now the Hebrew text even comes to the end by kind of like giving us setting like the punch into the text itself. And here it is. The law about Sabbath is in Exodus 20, verse 10. It's in Deuteronomy 5, also about the stranger. And in the middle, we have Exodus 23. So here is a comparison. In both places, in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy, the word is your stranger. The Hebrew word for the stranger is ger. In order to say your stranger, the Hebrews added the little syllable cha at the end. So they express it as ger cha in Exodus 20 and in Deuteronomy 5. But when the writer of Exodus 23 gives us the Sabbath commandment, he explicitly decides to go against that way of putting it. And so instead of adding the word, the syllable cha at the end, he puts a definite article in front of ger and says, this is not just your stranger, this is the stranger. And so we get to have ha-ger in there, right in the Sabbath commandment. It is this one who is supposed to be able to breathe, if you will, to not only to when the Sabbath keeper stops, ceases from work. It is Hagar, the name that we consider a name, and yet she never had a name in the family of Abraham and Sarah. She always was the stranger. That is what she was called. When they called her out, she said, chase away this maid, chase away Hagar, the stranger, and her son. And he sent her away. And yet, Exodus 23, God says, do not do that. Make sure she and her son are able to breathe freely. The next part is about the Sabbath and the sanctuary. In this case, we have the Sabbath texts in Exodus 31 and in Exodus 35. The one in Exodus 31 is a beautiful text. It's a long text. It consists of a lot of information, including that part where it says, do not work, because if you work, you shall die. And then Exodus 35 is the one, do not light a fire on Sabbath. And yet we read these texts and we do not make the connection, and we do not see or hear the story. Here is the story. These two Sabbath texts are placed into the center of the theme of the building of the sanctuary. We have the instructions to build it in long chapters from 25 to 31. And at the end of 31, we come to the Sabbath texts. And then we come to a story that just blows our minds. How could the people do that after they receive this gift of freedom and then they reject God and build the golden calf? And yet after the end of that story, it comes back to the Sabbath and then to the construction of the sanctuary, and everything is suddenly in other words, the world falls into place again. God is so pleased that he enters into that sanctuary without any reservations, even so much that no one can enter into there because God fills it with his presence. So what is it? What is the story here? Is it possible that we should reread that golden calf story at the middle in order to recognize that the deepest rebellious act that people can commit is enveloped by the holiest day? Is it possible that within that story of the golden calf, where Moses goes up and down to God to argue and to debate and to find a solution for this problem, but then he also goes back and forth in the camp because you see people have killed each other. About 3,000 or so, the story says, got killed that day. How can a community of people coexist when the neighbor on this side and on the other side is dead, when families live in such a way that they cannot look into each other's eyes? That's the golden calf story right there. And yet this movement that is described in that part in Exodus 32 to 34 about Moses going back and forth and going up and down, it's the story that brings God and people together, and it's the story that brings people together with each other. It's that there where Moses becomes this special person of an intercessor. He's an intercessor. He is a leader of the people, but most of all, he at the end is considered even a prophet. And later on in the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Bible, that is what prophets do. They have God and the people in one thought. They cannot separate between them. When Moses is with God, he entreats for the people in such a way that God cannot say no, so that his way of dealing with them turns. And when Moses is with the people, he says, how can you do that to God, who has done everything for you? That is the story of the golden calf. And that is the story that needs to be told when we deal with Sabbath inside a temple. Sabbath inside the church, if you will. And I would like here to place this citation from Elie Wiesel. He speaks of God is in an argument with humankind. God wants us to lose. God wanted Moses. God wants to lose, he himself, in other words. God wants Moses to win when he argues with him on the mountain. We are invited to argue with God. We are invited to disagree and to loudly express that. Because we learn that if you have to choose between God and man, you always choose the human being, says Elie Wiesel. And that is what Moses did. Moses expressed to God, you cannot know, I don't want you to go with me and make out of me another people. I need you to choose this people over and over again. And that is Moses' argument with God on that mountain. It is possible to argue, it's possible to protest and to shout against God, because indignation may in fact be the most authentic expression of faith. And so I believe in that wounded faith, because only a wounded faith can exist after those events. How could people who have killed each other continue living with each other only because of a faith that had suffered through an experience that had separated and destroyed, even destroyed life? There is one more story, and it is told in Numbers 15, but it belongs into the center of the Sabbath and the sanctuary. It is right there where you have all kinds of laws in Numbers 15 about the temple, how the offerings, how to offer those, what to bring and what, when to bring them, and so on. When is an offering accepted and when is it not? And at the end, there is a story, but it looks like that we do not hear that story, and we are not able to make something out of it. So here it is. It's the man who in the wilderness decided to go out to gather wood on the Sabbath. And you know it well, because it comes up again and again in our question. So what do we do with this text? Do we kill those who don't keep the Sabbath properly, who work on the Sabbath? So here it is. Here is the text. They took the man, they found him, and they brought him to Moses, and they did not know what to do with him. And so until they decided and knew what to do, they put him in custody. And then we have the word that he should be stoned to death, and he will. What if Moses and Aaron and the community had stood up for this man in the same way as Moses stood up for his people when they built the golden calf? Is it possible that this story exists here, but maybe we need, in the big picture of Sabbath and in the big picture of understanding the telling of stories, that maybe it needs to be retold? Is it possible to recognize that this man who goes out to gather wood, you see, this writer could have chosen at least 4 or 5 different words for that word to gather wood. They exist in the Hebrew language, but he chooses one that is only mentioned 2 other times, namely in the story when the Israelites are in Egypt and they are slaves, in Exodus 5, verse 7 and 12. That is when they have to go out to gather straw. And this is what the man does here. He turns himself back into a slave, if you will. He does that. And according to Numbers 15, it seems that he does that openly, willingly, high-handedly, right? So it's his choice. Do we let him go on with his choice? That's what the story does here. That's what it says. That is what the people do. But what if Moses had stood up and said, we need to bring this man back into this community where everybody is free, where you don't go out to gather straw like a slave? So they put him in custody. In other words, they make him rest. Nuach is the word that is used when God rests on Sabbath. And here they force the man to rest. But you see in the Bible, rest is not something that is forced. Rest is never something that comes because somebody makes you do it. It is always a gift. Its origin is always from God. And yet here, this man is forced. He's put into jail. Sabbath becomes a prison for him. Should we ask the question what our churches are for so many people who enter them? Almost like a fortress, almost like a custody. I believe the parts in the Bible that there are so many others, but I'm finishing up with Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah has read and understood all those texts about Sabbath. And especially in chapters 56 to 58, he turned Sabbath into a story about an expansive world. Not an expansive with an E, but an expansive with an A. It's a big world. It's a world where there are no walls and no boundaries and no exclusions. There is part of this Sabbath is the Israelite who comes back from Egypt and out of Babylon also. And all of them are part of it. There is also the Gentile who is invited into this community. And even the person who by law was excluded, namely the eunuch, according to the book of Deuteronomy, he does not have a place in that community. And yet, according to Isaiah, he is part of it. That is the world that Sabbath creates. So when Heschel writes about Sabbath in that way, and he calls Sabbath a temple in time available to all, it is because of this wondrous element. Not because we make Sabbath into a day that is the seventh one and that we need to keep because God has said so, but because God is part of it. And because God has invited all of us to be part of it. And that is what the story is all about. That is what God has written down.